5 minutes. That is all it took to alter the trajectory of human history, dismantle an empire, and avenge the ghosts of Pearl Harbor. Between 10:22 and 10:27 on the morning of June 4, 1942, 3 American aircraft carriers unleashed a coordinated dive-bombing strike that turned 3 elite Japanese fleet carriers into floating, secondary exploding infernos. Welcome to our deep dive into the Battle of Midway, a clash of steel, strategy, and sheer industrial willpower that remains the most decisive naval engagement since Lord Nelson crossed the T at Trafalgar. If you want to understand how wars are actually won, not just in the movies, but in the grim reality of logistics, intelligence, and armor-piercing ordnance, hit that subscribe button, leave a comment with your thoughts, and join our community of armchair generals and history buffs. To understand the sheer magnitude of what happened in the Central Pacific, we cannot simply start on the morning of the battle. We have to rewind the clock and look at the strategic bedrock that made this violent collision inevitable. You might be asking, why would a nation with a fraction of America's industrial might, a nation the size of California, pick a fight it mathematically could not win? The answer lies in decades of naval doctrine, a ticking economic time bomb, and a fundamental misunderstanding of the American psychological threshold. Ever since the Japanese Navy annihilated the Russian Baltic Fleet at the Battle of Tsushima in 1905, the Imperial Japanese Navy had been obsessed with a single tactical concept known as Kantai Kessen, or the decisive battle doctrine. They envisioned a scenario where an advancing enemy fleet, specifically the US Navy, would be whittled down by submarines and destroyers as it crossed the vast Pacific, before being completely destroyed in a single massive battleship engagement near Japan. This was their gospel, their tactical holy grail, and they built their entire fleet architecture around it. But the Washington Naval Treaty of 1922 threw a massive wrench into their battleship production. The treaty locked Japan into a 5-to-5-to-3 ratio regarding capital ships, meaning for every 5 tons of battleship the US and Britain could build, Japan could only build 3. Feeling cornered, Japanese naval architects did what any cornered predator does. They innovated. They poured their resources into areas not heavily restricted by the treaty, specifically aircraft carriers, heavy cruisers, and torpedo technology. They developed the Type 93 long-lance torpedo, a 24-inch oxygen-fueled monster that could travel 24 miles at 36 knots and deliver a 1,080-pound warhead, leaving virtually no wake. By the late 1930s, the Imperial Japanese Navy possessed the most combat-experienced, highly trained naval aviation force on the planet. They had blooded their pilots in the skies over China, flying hundreds of combat sorties before most American pilots had even earned their wings. But Japan had a fatal weakness, a total lack of domestic natural resources. They needed oil, rubber, and scrap iron to fuel their war machine in China. When the United States, responding to Japanese aggression in Indochina, slapped a devastating oil embargo on Tokyo in the summer of 1941, the Japanese strategic clock started ticking loudly. They had about 18 months of oil reserves left for their navy. The strike on Pearl Harbor in December 1941 was supposed to be a knockout blow designed to cripple the US Pacific Fleet for 6 months, allowing Japan to conquer the resource-rich Dutch East Indies and fortify a defensive perimeter so strong that the Americans would simply sue for peace. But they missed the American aircraft carriers, which were out at sea, and they failed to destroy the fuel depots and submarine pens in Hawaii. Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto, the commander-in-chief of the combined fleet, knew the clock was still ticking, and he knew the American carriers were a dagger pointed at the heart of the empire. Yamamoto had studied at Harvard and served as a naval attaché in Washington. He had seen the oil fields of Texas and the auto plants of Detroit. He knew perfectly well that if the war dragged out, the arsenal of democracy would crush Japan under a tidal wave of steel and aluminum. He needed to force the remaining U.S. carriers into a final decisive engagement before American industry could shift into high gear. The catalyst for Yamamoto's Midway plan came on April 18, 1942. 16 B-25 Mitchell medium bombers, commanded by Lieutenant Colonel James Doolittle, launched from the pitching deck of the USS Hornet and bombed Tokyo. The Doolittle raid did negligible physical damage, but the psychological shockwave in Japan was seismic. The Emperor's palace had been threatened. Yamamoto considered this a personal failure and a national humiliation. He immediately finalized his complex, overly elaborate plan to attack Midway Atoll, a tiny speck of coral and sand 1,300 miles northwest of Hawaii. Midway was practically the front porch of Pearl Harbor. Yamamoto's logic was simple. If Japan threatened Midway, Admiral Chester Nimitz, Commander-in-Chief of the U.S. Pacific Fleet, would be forced to send his precious carriers out to defend it. Yamamoto would then spring a trap with his battleships and heavy cruisers, sinking the U.S. carriers and forcing America to the negotiating table. It was a brilliant plan on paper, but military history is littered with the corpses of commanders who relied on overly complex plans. Think back to the British during the American Revolution, specifically the Saratoga Campaign in 1777. British General John Burgoyne devised a highly complex plan for 3 separate columns to converge on Albany, New York, assuming perfect coordination and ignoring the rugged terrain and the resilience of American militia. The plan fell apart, communication failed, and Burgoyne lost his entire army. Yamamoto's plan suffered from the exact same hubris. He divided his massive armada into multiple, widely separated flotillas. There was a diversionary force heading to the Aleutian Islands in Alaska, an invasion force heading for Midway, the elite carrier striking force known as the Kido Butai to soften up the island, and Yamamoto's own main body of battleships trailing hundreds of miles behind. He violated the fundamental military principle of concentration of force. He assumed the Americans would react exactly as he scripted, playing the role of the compliant victim. But Admiral Chester Nimitz was not reading from Yamamoto's script. The reason Nimitz was not reading the script was because he was reading Yamamoto's mail. In the basement of the 14th Naval District Administration Building at Pearl Harbor, a windowless, heavily guarded room known as Station HYPO, Commander Joseph Rochefort and his team of eccentric, brilliant cryptanalysts were working 20-hour days. Rochefort was a maverick, often wearing a smoking jacket and slippers in the freezing, air-conditioned basement, surviving on coffee and sheer nervous energy. His team had managed to crack portions of the Japanese naval code, known as JN-25. By May 1942, they were intercepting messages pointing to a massive upcoming operation aimed at a target designated as AF. Washington intelligence analysts believed AF was somewhere in the South Pacific, perhaps Port Moresby, or even the west coast of the United States. But Rochefort was convinced AF was Midway. To prove it, he devised a brilliant deception, instructing the garrison at Midway to broadcast a fake unencrypted message stating their water distillation plant was broken. Days later, HYPO intercepted a Japanese message reporting that Objective AF was short of fresh water. The trap was confirmed. This intelligence coup is arguably the most significant in American military history, rivaling George Washington's Culper spy ring, which operated in British-occupied New York and provided the precise intelligence that allowed French and American forces to trap Lord Cornwallis at Yorktown. Armed with this knowledge, Nimitz knew the exact date of the attack, the composition of the Japanese forces, and their approach vectors. He decided to set a trap for the trappers. Let us look at the heavy metal, the force comparison that would dictate the brutal mathematics of this engagement. The tip of the Japanese spear was the Kido Butai, the 1st Air Fleet, commanded by Vice Admiral Chuichi Nagumo. This force consisted of 4 heavy fleet carriers, the Akagi, Kaga, Soryu, and Hiryu. These were the veterans of Pearl Harbor, Darwin, and the Indian Ocean raids. The Akagi and Kaga were massive vessels, originally laid down as a battle cruiser and a battleship respectively, before being converted to carriers under the treaty limits. The Akagi displaced over 36,000 tons, capable of 31 knots, and carried over 60 operational aircraft. The Kaga was slightly slower, but carried a massive air group of over 70 planes. The Soryu and Hiryu were purpose-built medium fleet carriers, fast, highly maneuverable, and lethal. Combined, Nagumo commanded a striking force of 248 highly advanced aircraft. The Japanese fighter aircraft was the legendary Mitsubishi A6M0. The Zero was a marvel of aeronautical engineering for its time. It was incredibly lightweight, capable of reaching 331 miles per hour, with a staggering range of over 1,900 miles, and a turn radius that could leave any Allied fighter spinning in confusion. It was armed with 2 7mm machine guns and 2 devastating 20mm cannons. But the Zero's performance came at a fatal cost. To save weight, Mitsubishi engineers stripped it of all armor plating and self-sealing fuel tanks. It was, essentially, a flying gas can. If an American pilot could get a burst of heavy-caliber fire into a Zero, it would explode like a firecracker. For strike aircraft, the Japanese utilized the Nakajima B-5N, Allied reporting name Kate, widely considered the best torpedo bomber in the world at the time. It was fast, had a long range, and carried the deadly Type 91 aerial torpedo, which was highly reliable and packed a massive punch. Their dive bomber was the Aichi D-3A, known as the Val, a rugged aircraft with fixed landing gear that had proven incredibly accurate in the opening months of the war. But what about the men leading this formidable force? Vice Admiral Nagumo was a surface warfare officer by trade, a torpedo specialist. He was cautious, bound by rigid doctrine, and fundamentally lacked the aggressive, flexible mindset required for fast-paced carrier warfare. He was chosen by seniority, a fatal flaw in the rigid hierarchy of the Imperial Japanese Navy. How do you put a battleship admiral in charge of the most dynamic aviation asset on Earth and expect him to adapt to chaos? You do not, and the Americans were about to prove why. Facing this juggernaut was the United States Pacific Fleet, battered, outnumbered, but armed with the ultimate weapon of surprise. Admiral Nimitz scraped together every available hull to form Task Forces 16 and 17. He had 3 carriers at his disposal, the USS Enterprise, the USS Hornet, and the heavily damaged USS Yorktown. The Yorktown had taken a severe beating at the Battle of the Coral Sea just a month prior. A 550-pound bomb had penetrated her flight deck, causing massive internal damage. Navy engineers estimated it would take 3 months in the Bremerton shipyards to repair her. Nimitz gave the Pearl Harbor Navy Yard 3 days. In a display of American industrial grit that the Japanese completely failed to calculate, over 1,400 civilian contractors and naval engineers swarmed the Yorktown as she sat in dry dock. They worked around the clock, cutting away twisted steel, patching the hull, and repairing the flight deck while the ship was still taking on provisions. After just 72 hours, the Yorktown sailed out of Pearl Harbor, her repair crews still on board, welding bulkheads as she steamed toward the Midway rendezvous point. The Yorktown-class carriers were magnificent ships, displacing about 25,000 tons and capable of 32 knots. Unlike the Japanese carriers, American carriers featured open hangar decks, which allowed aircraft engines to be warmed up below deck and provided natural ventilation in case of explosive fires. The American air groups consisted of 233 carrier-based aircraft, plus an additional 127 land-based planes stationed on Midway itself. The frontline American fighter was the Grumman F-4F Wildcat. Compared to the Zero, the Wildcat looked like a flying beer keg. It was slower, topping out at 318 miles per hour, and it could not turn with the Japanese fighter to save its life. But Grumman built the Wildcat like a tank. It had heavy armor plating behind the pilot's seat, self-sealing fuel tanks, and a battery of 6.50 caliber Browning machine guns that could saw a Japanese plane in half. American pilots, led by innovators like Lieutenant Commander John Thatch, had developed tactics like the Thatch Weave, a two-plane defensive maneuver designed to negate the Zero's turning advantage by creating overlapping fields of fire. The American torpedo bomber was the Douglas TBD Devastator. To call the Devastator obsolete would be a compliment. It was painfully slow, cruising at a sluggish 128 miles per hour while carrying a torpedo, making it a sitting duck for anti-aircraft fire and enemy fighters. Worse yet, its primary weapon, the Mark 13 torpedo, was an absolute disaster of naval ordnance. It frequently ran too deep, ran in circles, or simply failed to detonate upon striking the target. The brave men who flew the Devastators were essentially being asked to charge a machine gun nest on horseback. But the true hero of the American arsenal was the Douglas SBD Dauntless dive bomber. The Dauntless was a rugged, reliable aircraft capable of carrying a 1,000-pound armor-piercing bomb. It featured distinctive perforated dive flaps that allowed it to enter a screaming 70-degree dive without exceeding its terminal velocity, providing a stable platform for incredible accuracy. The Dauntless would be the instrument of American wrath. Commanding the American task forces were two distinct personalities. Task Force 17, centered on the Yorktown, was commanded by Rear Admiral Frank Jack Fletcher, the victor of Coral Sea, a steady and experienced combat leader. Task Force 16, comprising the Enterprise and Hornet, was commanded by Rear Admiral Raymond Spruance. Spruance was a last-minute replacement for Vice Admiral William Bull Halsey, who had been hospitalized with a severe case of stress-induced dermatitis. Spruance, like Nagumo, was a cruiser admiral, not an aviator. But unlike Nagumo, Spruance was cold, calculating, and ruthlessly logical. He was a master of operational planning and possessed a brilliant tactical mind that could process chaos without panicking. He relied heavily on Halsey's brilliant aviation chief of staff, Captain Miles Browning, to handle the technical details of flight operations. The stage was set, the hardware was loaded, and the men were steaming toward a patch of ocean known as Point Luck, 300 miles northeast of Midway. The Japanese believed they were sailing into a turkey shoot against an unsuspecting island garrison. They had no radar on their carriers, relying entirely on visual lookouts and a rigid, inflexible doctrine that left zero room for the friction of war. The Americans were waiting in ambush, armed with decrypted intelligence, heavy machine guns, and a burning desire for retribution. As the sun dipped below the horizon on the evening of June 3, 1942, the vast Pacific swallowed the silhouettes of dozens of warships. Thousands of sailors and aviators tried to catch a few hours of sleep in the sweltering heat below decks, knowing that by tomorrow afternoon, many of them would be dead. The dawn patrol is fueling up, the engines are coughing to life, and the fate of the free world is about to be decided in the clouds. At 4:30 in the morning on June 4th, the silence of the Central Pacific was shattered by the roar of 108 radial engines warming up on the wooden flight decks of the Kido Butai. Under the command of Lieutenant Joichi Tominaga, the first Japanese strike wave lifted off into the pre-dawn darkness, heavily armed and vectoring directly toward Midway Atoll. Vice Admiral Nagumo stood on the bridge of the Akagi, confident in his rigid operational timetable. He kept a reserve force of 93 aircraft below on the hangar decks, meticulously armed with Type 91 armor-piercing torpedoes, waiting for the American fleet to show up exactly when Japanese doctrine dictated they should. But weather in the Pacific is a fickle, highly localized weapon, and on this morning it heavily favored the Americans. The Japanese fleet was operating under a thick frontal system, a low overcast ceiling that restricted visibility and hid their movements, but also blinded their own scout planes. Meanwhile, Task Forces 16 and 17 were sailing under crystal-clear blue skies just a few hundred miles to the east. At 5:34 a.m., an American PBY Catalina flying boat, piloted by Lieutenant Howard Adey, broke through a patch of clouds and spotted the unmistakable wake of the Japanese armada. Adey keyed his radio and transmitted the two words Admiral Nimitz had been waiting weeks to hear: enemy carriers. The trap was officially sprung, but executing a carrier strike in 1942 was not like pushing a button on a modern missile cruiser. We need to understand the terrifying, highly combustible mechanics of naval aviation in this era. An aircraft carrier is essentially a floating bomb factory strapped to a high-octane gas station. To launch a strike, dozens of aircraft had to be hauled up on elevators from the hangar deck, physically pushed into position by deck crews, and fueled from hoses dangling from the bulkheads. Aviation fuel in World War II was not the stable jet fuel we use today. It was highly volatile, 100-octane aviation gasoline. The fumes alone could pool in the hangar deck and detonate from a single stray spark. Once fueled, ordnancemen had to manually lug 500-pound and 1,000-pound bombs on metal carts, winching them up onto the racks of the aircraft. It was a ballet of heavy industry, explosive chemicals, and exhausted young men working on a steel deck, pitching in the ocean swells. There were two primary methods to deliver this ordnance to an enemy ship, and they required vastly different tactical approaches. Torpedo bombing was a grim, nerve-wracking mathematical equation. A torpedo plane like the American Devastator had to drop down to just 100 feet above the water, slow its airspeed to a crawl of about 110 miles per hour, and fly in a perfectly straight line for over a mile to give the torpedo the proper trajectory to arm and run. During that straight, agonizingly slow run, the aircraft was a sitting duck for every anti-aircraft gun on the enemy ship and every enemy fighter in the sky. Dive bombing, on the other hand, was an act of controlled suicide from high altitude. An SBD Dauntless would approach at 15,000 feet, roll inverted, and drop into a screaming 70-degree dive directly over the target. Gravity accelerated the aircraft to over 250 miles per hour, allowing the pilot to use the entire plane as an aiming reticle. At 1,500 feet, the pilot pulled a lever to release a 1,000-pound armor-piercing bomb, which would strike the enemy deck with the kinetic energy of a freight train, punching through the thin flight deck and detonating inside the enclosed hangar spaces. Dive bombing was incredibly accurate and lethally destructive, but it required precise timing and the element of surprise. Back at Midway, the element of surprise was gone, and the island's defenders knew they were about to be hammered. Instead of waiting to be destroyed on the ground, Midway launched every operational aircraft it had to strike the incoming Japanese fleet. It was a desperate, ragtag armada consisting of obsolete Marine Corps F-2A Brewster Buffalo fighters, slow Vindicator dive bombers, Army Air Force's B-26 Marauders jury-rigged to carry torpedoes, and a detachment of brand-new TBF Avenger torpedo bombers seeing combat for the very first time. Between 7 a.m. and 8:30 a.m., these uncoordinated American squadrons threw themselves at the Kido Butai. It was a slaughter. The Japanese Combat Air Patrol, swarms of highly maneuverable Zero fighters, tore into the American formations. The Brewster Buffaloes were blown out of the sky with casual ease by veteran Japanese pilots. The B-26s and Avengers dropped their torpedoes, but the Japanese carriers simply turned hard to port or starboard, easily outrunning the slow-moving weapons. Not a single American bomb or torpedo struck a Japanese ship during this morning assault. But in warfare, tactical failure can sometimes generate massive strategic leverage. Why did this failed attack matter? Because it forced Admiral Nagumo to make a series of rapid, high-stakes decisions that would seal the fate of the Japanese Empire. At 7:15 a.m., Lieutenant Tomonaga, returning from bombing Midway, radioed Nagumo with a blunt assessment, stating, "There is need for a second attack." Midway's runways were still operational, and its shore batteries were still intact. Nagumo looked at his reserve force sitting on the hangar deck, 93 planes armed with anti-ship torpedoes, waiting for an American fleet that had not yet materialized. He was bound by doctrine, and doctrine dictated that a threat to the carriers must be neutralized. Nagumo made a fateful call. He ordered his deck crews to strip the torpedoes off the reserve planes and rearm them with 800-pound high-explosive land bombs for a second strike on Midway. Imagine the chaos on the enclosed hangar decks of the Akagi and Kaga. Hundreds of mechanics and ordnancemen, sweating in the suffocating heat, frantically cranked winches to lower the massive torpedoes back onto carts. They had to carefully unhook the release mechanisms, roll the torpedoes to the side, hoist up the land bombs, and secure them to the racks. It was a grueling, hours-long process that left the hangar decks cluttered with unsecured, highly explosive ordnance. Then, at 7:28 a.m., the friction of war struck the Japanese bridge like a physical blow. A Japanese scout plane, designated Tone No. 4, which had been delayed by a faulty catapult for half an hour, suddenly transmitted a chilling message. The pilot reported seeing 10 ships, apparently enemy, about 240 miles away. Nagumo froze. Were these just cruisers and destroyers, or were there aircraft carriers? He halted the rearmament process immediately. At 8:09 a.m., the scout plane sent an update that stopped the hearts of the Japanese command staff, reporting that the enemy force was accompanied by what appeared to be an aircraft carrier. Nagumo was now caught in the ultimate commander's nightmare. His strike force returning from Midway was low on fuel and riddled with bullets, needing to land immediately. His reserve force on the hangar deck was caught in a chaotic state of half-armament, with some planes carrying land bombs, some carrying torpedoes, and the decks littered with unsecured explosives. If he launched his reserve now, they would be attacking an American carrier with the wrong weapons. If he waited to recover his returning planes and properly rearm the reserve with torpedoes, he would be a sitting duck for an American strike. He chose to wait, recover his planes, and prepare a massive, perfectly coordinated strike. This rigid adherence to standard operating procedure mirrors the disastrous mindset of British General Edward Braddock during the French and Indian War in 1755. Marching his redcoats through the dense Pennsylvania woods, Braddock insisted on maintaining European linear formations, refusing to let his men break ranks and fight from behind cover when ambushed. He valued the perfection of the formation over the reality of the environment, and his army was annihilated by a highly mobile, adaptive enemy. Nagumo was committing the exact same sin, prioritizing a perfectly organized strike package over the immediate, messy necessity of getting heavily armed planes off his vulnerable flight decks. While Nagumo hesitated, Admiral Raymond Spruance on the USS Enterprise was operating with cold, calculated aggression. Spruance knew the Japanese carriers were out there, and he knew they would be busy dealing with the strikes from Midway. He did not wait for his squadrons to form up into a massive, heavily escorted armada. He calculated the intercept angles, factored in the wind, and ordered his air groups to launch early, piecemeal if necessary. His objective was simple: hit the enemy while their decks were full of planes and fuel. Launch everything, he ordered. Get them into the air. The American launch was a disjointed, chaotic affair. Fighter squadrons lost contact with dive bombers, and torpedo squadrons were left flying completely unescorted. They navigated across hundreds of miles of featureless ocean using dead reckoning, a simple compass, a clock, and a prayer. When the American groups arrived at the projected intercept point, the ocean was empty. Nagumo had changed course, turning northeast to close the distance with the American fleet. Fuel gauges were dropping, and panic was setting in among the American flight leaders. This is where the sheer, stubborn instinct of a single combat commander changed the course of the battle. Lieutenant Commander John C. Waldron, commanding Torpedo Squadron 8 from the USS Hornet, fundamentally disagreed with his air group commander's navigational plot. Waldron, a tough, seasoned veteran of Oglala Lakota descent, trusted his gut over the flawed calculations of his superiors. He broke radio silence and declared that if the rest of the group would not follow him, he was taking his squadron alone. Waldron banked his 15 obsolete Douglas Devastator torpedo bombers to the southwest. At 9:25 a.m., Waldron looked down through the broken clouds and saw the distinct white wakes of the Kido Butai. He had found the Japanese fleet. But Waldron had no fighter cover, no dive bombers to distract the anti-aircraft gunners, and he was flying an aircraft that belonged in a museum. He knew exactly what was about to happen. He ordered his men to drop to the deck, skimming just feet above the ocean swells, and commit to the attack run. High above the Japanese fleet, nearly 50 Zero fighters of the Combat Air Patrol spotted the slow, dark green American planes lumbering toward them. The Zeros rolled over and dove like falcons. What followed was not a battle. It was an execution. The Zeros slashed through Torpedo Squadron 8, their 20mm cannons tearing huge chunks of aluminium off the Devastators. Cockpits shattered, engines caught fire, and planes slammed into the ocean in violent cartwheels of spray and flame. The Devastator's rear gunners, armed with single-point .30 caliber machine guns, fired back desperately, but it was useless against the armored glass and speed of the Zeros. Within minutes, all 15 aircraft of Torpedo Squadron 8 were blown out of the sky. 30 men were killed. Only one pilot, Ensign George Gay, survived, hiding under a floating seat cushion in the middle of the Japanese fleet. Not a single torpedo found its mark. Shortly after Waldron's destruction, Torpedo Squadron 6 from the Enterprise arrived, led by Lieutenant Commander Eugene Lindsay. They attacked with the same suicidal bravery, flying straight into a wall of anti-aircraft fire and swarming Zeros. 10 out of 14 Devastators were annihilated. Then came Torpedo Squadron 3 from the Yorktown, led by Lieutenant Commander Lance Massey. They were shredded just as ruthlessly, losing 10 of their 12 aircraft. Out of 41 American torpedo bombers that attacked the Japanese fleet that morning, 35 were destroyed, and they scored 0 hits. It is easy to look at this horrific slaughter and write it off as a tragic, useless waste of life. Did these men die for absolutely nothing? To understand the tactical impact of their sacrifice, we have to look at the Battle of Gettysburg in 1863, specifically the charge of the 1st Minnesota Infantry on the second day of fighting. Union General Winfield Scott Hancock ordered the 262 men of the 1st Minnesota to charge a Confederate brigade of over 1,200 men. It was a suicide mission, designed solely to buy 5 minutes of time for Union reinforcements to plug a gap in the line. The regiment suffered 82% casualties, the highest of any surviving unit in the Civil War. But they bought the time, stopped the Confederate advance, and saved the Union position. The men of the American torpedo squadrons at Midway were the 1st Minnesota of the Pacific War. They did not sink any ships, but they achieved 3 critical tactical objectives that set up the greatest ambush in naval history. First, their low-level attacks forced the Japanese carriers into violent, evasive maneuvers, which prevented them from turning into the wind to launch their own strike planes. Second, they forced the entire Japanese combat air patrol to drop down to sea level to intercept them, leaving the high-altitude airspace completely undefended. Third, they exhausted the Japanese fighter pilots, burning up their fuel and emptying their 20mm ammunition drums. By 10:20 a.m., the sky above the Kido Butai was finally clear of American torpedo planes. Admiral Nagumo breathed a sigh of relief. His fleet was intact, his Zeros were beginning to land to refuel, and his hangar decks were fully loaded with fueled, heavily armed aircraft, ready to launch and annihilate the American carriers. The Japanese ships turned into the wind, the flight decks pitched up, and the launch orders were shouted over the loudspeakers. But at that exact second, 15,000 feet above the Japanese fleet, hidden perfectly in the blinding glare of the mid-morning sun, Lieutenant Commander C. Wade McClusky and Lieutenant Commander Max Leslie were looking down through their bomb sights. 2 full squadrons of American SBD Dauntless dive bombers had arrived precisely at the climax of the battle, staring down at a target-rich environment that no naval aviator could have ever dreamed of. At 10:22 a.m., the sky fell on the Imperial Japanese Navy. Lieutenant Commander C. Wade McClusky had been flying on fumes, leading his air group over empty ocean, when he noticed a single white wake cutting across the blue expanse. It was the Japanese destroyer Arashi, speeding north to rejoin the main fleet after depth-charging an American submarine. McClusky made a split-second mathematical gamble, altered his course to follow the destroyer, and was rewarded with the sight of the entire Kido Butai spread out below him. Because the Japanese combat air patrol had been dragged down to sea level by the suicidal attacks of the American torpedo squadrons, The airspace at 15,000 feet was completely uncontested. The American dive bombers pushed their noses over, deployed their perforated dive flaps, and initiated a screaming 70-degree plunge toward the wooden decks of the enemy carriers. Standard American tactical doctrine dictated that the leading squadron should attack the far target, while the trailing squadron should take the near target, preventing a cluster of aircraft from diving on the exact same ship. But in the adrenaline-fueled chaos of the dive, communication broke down, and both of McClusky's squadrons, nearly 30 aircraft, converged on the carrier Kaga. How does a military force process a sudden, catastrophic breakdown in communication during the most critical 5 seconds of a war? If you are bound by rigid, inflexible doctrine, you panic and pile on. But if you foster a culture of individual initiative, you adapt on the fly. Lieutenant Richard Best, commanding Bombing Squadron 6, saw the swarm of Dauntlesses dropping toward the Kaga and instantly realized that the flagship, the Akagi, was being completely ignored. Fighting the intense G-forces of the dive, Best aggressively pulled his aircraft out of the formation, signaling his 2 wingmen to follow him in a desperate, improvised attack on Vice Admiral Nagumo's flagship. Down below, the Kaga disappeared under a barrage of at least 4 direct hits from 1,000-pound armor-piercing bombs. These weapons punched right through the wooden flight deck and detonated inside the enclosed hangar spaces, which were packed wing to wing with fully fueled Kate torpedo bombers and unsecured, highly volatile ordnance. The resulting sympathetic detonations ripped the massive carrier apart from the inside out, blowing out the sides of the hangar deck and turning the ship into a floating, uncontrollable furnace. Meanwhile, Richard Best and his 2 wingmen lined up their sights on the Akagi. The first bomb missed, sending up a geyser of water that drenched the bridge, and the second bomb missed just off the stern. Best dropped the third and final bomb from an altitude of just 1,500 feet. It was a perfect, devastating strike that penetrated the midships elevator and exploded in the upper hangar. Because Admiral Nagumo had hesitated earlier, ordering his crews to switch from land bombs to torpedoes and back again, the Akagi's hangar deck was a chaotic mess of high-explosive aviation fuel, oxygen tanks, and loose torpedoes. Best's single bomb triggered a chain reaction that instantly doomed the pride of the Japanese fleet, forcing Nagumo to unceremoniously abandon his flagship by climbing down a rope out of a window. Simultaneously, Lieutenant Commander Max Leslie's squadron from the Yorktown arrived over the carrier Soryu. Leslie himself did not even have a bomb, as a faulty electrical switch had caused his ordnance to drop into the ocean an hour earlier. But he dove anyway, strafing the Japanese deck with his .50 caliber machine guns to suppress anti-aircraft fire for his men. The Soryu was struck by 3 1,000-pound bombs, which ignited her aviation fuel lines and caused her boiler rooms to violently explode. Between 10:22 and 10:27 a.m., a span of just 5 minutes, the strategic balance of the Pacific War was permanently shattered. 3 elite Japanese aircraft carriers, the absolute core of their naval striking power, were transformed into burning, sinking wrecks. The remaining Japanese carrier, the Hiryu, managed to launch a desperate counterstrike that heavily damaged the USS Yorktown, forcing her crew to abandon ship. But later that same afternoon, American dive bombers found the Hiryu and pounded her into a blazing inferno, completing the total annihilation of the Kido Butai. To understand why this battle was so lopsided, despite the Japanese numerical and technological superiority, we have to look past the heroics of the pilots and examine the cold, brutal realities of naval architecture and damage control. The United States Navy treated damage control as a religion. Every single sailor on an American warship, from the cooks to the radar operators, was heavily cross-trained in firefighting, bulkhead shoring, and emergency patching. American carriers were designed with redundant fire mains, open hangar decks that allowed explosive gases to vent into the atmosphere, and extensive compartmentalization to prevent flooding. The Imperial Japanese Navy, conversely, viewed damage control as an afterthought, an engineering problem meant to be handled by a small, specialized group of mechanics. When those specialized Japanese damage control officers were killed in the initial blasts, the rest of the crew had absolutely no idea how to fight the massive aviation fuel fires, dooming their ships to burn to the waterline. This cultural difference in military architecture mirrors the American Civil War, specifically the industrial pragmatism of the Union versus the martial elan of the Confederacy. The Confederacy produced brilliant, aggressive battlefield tacticians like Robert E. Lee and Stonewall Jackson, men who believed that superior fighting spirit and offensive audacity could overcome any obstacle. But the Union, under Ulysses S. Grant, understood that modern wars are not won by spirit alone. They are won by logistics, standardized production, armored trains, and relentless industrial output. Japan was the Confederacy of the Pacific, fighting a romanticized, aggressive war of rapid conquest, completely ignoring the fact that they were waking an industrial giant that would simply outproduce, outbuild, and out-repair them. Consider the economic and logistical disparity that Midway exposed. When the Japanese lost their veteran pilots in the burning wreckage of their carriers, those men were gone forever, because the Japanese pilot training program was an artisanal, highly exclusive pipeline designed to wash out 90% of applicants to find a handful of perfect warriors. The United States Navy, however, treated pilot training like a Ford assembly line, standardizing the curriculum and pumping out thousands of highly competent, well-trained aviators every single month. Furthermore, in the year 1942, the United States Congress had already passed the Two-Ocean Navy Act, and American shipyards were in the process of laying down over 20 massive Essex-class fleet carriers. Even if the United States had lost all 3 carriers at Midway, the American industrial machine would have replaced them within a year, whereas Japan simply did not have the steel, the oil, or the shipyards to replace the 4 carriers they lost in a single afternoon. We also cannot overstate the supreme strategic leverage of signals intelligence in modern warfare. Commander Joseph Rochefort and his team at Station HYPO did not fire a single bullet, yet their ability to crack the JN-25 code was the ultimate combat multiplier. This is highly reminiscent of the Zimmermann telegram during World War I, where British intelligence intercepted a secret German diplomatic communication proposing an alliance with Mexico. The British decryption of that single telegram fundamentally shifted the global balance of power by bringing the United States into the First World War, proving that information superiority is often more lethal than artillery. At Midway, Rochefort's intelligence allowed Admiral Nimitz to position his numerically inferior forces in the exact right place, at the exact right time, to maximize the destructive potential of his dive bombers. It was an ambush on a strategic scale, echoing George Washington's audacious crossing of the Delaware River to attack the Hessian garrison at Trenton in 1776. Washington knew his Continental Army could not stand toe-to-toe with the Hessian mercenaries in a conventional European-style pitched battle. So he leveraged intelligence, weather, and absolute operational surprise to catch the enemy in a moment of maximum vulnerability, completely destroying their combat effectiveness before they could even form their lines. Admiral Spruance and Admiral Fletcher executed the exact same concept on a massive three-dimensional oceanic battlefield. They caught the Japanese carriers with their decks full of fuel, bombs, and aircraft, trapped in the middle of a chaotic rearmament process. The Battle of Midway permanently broke the offensive back of the Imperial Japanese Navy, forcing them into a grueling, bloody war of attrition that they mathematically could not win. It proved that in the brutal calculus of modern mechanized warfare, rigid doctrine and overconfidence will always be punished by adaptability, superior intelligence, and overwhelming industrial violence. The ghosts of Pearl Harbor were not avenged by chance. They were avenged by cryptanalysts working in a freezing basement, by mechanics welding bulkheads in dry dock, and by young men in obsolete aircraft flying straight into a wall of anti-aircraft fire. War is never simply a contest of superior weaponry. It is the ultimate test of a nation's capacity to process friction, adapt to chaos, and sustain the grueling logistical reality of violence. Which factor do you believe was the absolute most critical in securing the American victory at Midway? A. The code-breaking brilliance of Station HYPO that provided the exact time and location of the attack. B. The suicidal bravery of the torpedo squadrons that pulled the Japanese fighters out of position. C. The fatal hesitation and rigid tactical doctrine of Japanese Admiral Nagumo. Let us know your choice and your reasoning in the comments below.